The dust had not yet settled on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, when Levi Fairchild's horse nearly collapsed beneath him, its flanks heaving and dark with sweat from a ride that should have taken 3 hours but had taken barely 1.5. Levi did not care about the horse's exhaustion any more than he cared about the way his own lungs burned or the way the morning sun drove needles into his eyes. He cared about one thing only, and that one thing was currently walking through the front door of the Caldwell train station with a carpet bag in each hand and a ticket to St. Louis folded neatly in the breast pocket of her traveling coat. Anna Shelton was leaving, and she did not know he was coming. He swung down from the saddle before the horse fully stopped, his boots hitting the dry earth so hard the impact shot straight up through his knees. He grabbed the reins and looped them around the nearest post without ceremony, already moving, already pushing through the small crowd of travelers clustered near the station's painted wooden awning. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with hands that had spent 15 years moving cattle and fixing fences, and people stepped aside for him without being asked. But when he burst through the station door and his eyes swept the room, his chest seized. She was there, standing at the far end of the narrow waiting room, speaking in a low voice to the station clerk. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a cream-colored bonnet, and she wore her Sunday traveling dress, the deep blue one that made her eyes look like deep water in winter. She was beautiful and composed, and she looked like someone who had already made her peace with every decision she had ever made. She had not seen him yet. He crossed the room in 6 strides and said her name. Anna. She turned slowly, as if some part of her had been expecting it and had dreaded it in equal measure. The composure on her face held for exactly 1 second before something cracked behind her eyes, something raw and aching that she quickly covered over with a cool, careful expression that did not reach her lips. Levi, her voice was quiet. You should not be here. I know it, he said. I know it better than anyone, but I am here anyway. The station clerk cleared his throat and looked at his ledger. Around them, 2 other passengers pretended to study the departure board nailed to the wall. The smell of coal smoke drifted through the open window, and somewhere outside, the distant whistle of an approaching train began to rise. The train from Wichita arrives in 11 minutes, she said, as if he needed to be informed of that, as if that fact was meant to be a warning. Then you have 11 minutes to hear what I should have said 3 months ago, he told her, and he took off his hat. Levi Fairchild had never been a man who removed his hat easily. It was a small thing, the kind of gesture that most men in the Kansas territory made without thinking, but for Levi it had always felt uncomfortably close to surrender. To stand bareheaded before someone was to stand without armor. He had not done it in front of a woman since his mother's funeral 11 years ago. He did it now, and he held the hat in both hands, and he looked at Anna Shelton with everything he had been too proud, too frightened, and too foolish to show her, and he started to talk. To understand what brought them to this moment in the Caldwell station, with the ground shaking faintly from an oncoming locomotive, and a woman's carefully packed life balanced on 2 carpet bags, you have to go back to the spring of 1882, when the grasslands of Sumner County were still sweet with the last of the bluest earn blooms, and Levi Fairchild's Broken Bow Ranch had just survived its 2nd consecutive hard winter by the barest margin imaginable. Levi had inherited the Broken Bow from his father, Daniel Fairchild, who had claimed the land in 1868 when the cattle drives from Texas first started pushing north through Kansas on what men were already calling the Kishom Trail. Daniel had been a hard man but a fair one, the kind of father who praised with silence and corrected with a firm look. He had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1879, leaving Levi a ranch of 4,000 acres, a herd of 312 longhorns, a crippling amount of debt on the south pasture fence, and no mother, no wife, no siblings, and no help except for 2 hired hands named Clem Wheeler and old Hector Salinas, who had been with the Fairchild family since before Levi was born. Levi had been 26 when he inherited all of it. He was 29 now, and the ranch was beginning to breathe again after nearly breaking him. That spring, a woman arrived in Caldwell the way many women arrived in small Kansas towns in those years, quietly, without much announcement, carrying more life experience than the town expected and fewer resources than she deserved. Anna Shelton came from St. Louis originally, the daughter of a pharmacist who had died when she was 22, leaving her with a modest education, a talent for figures, and a mother who had since remarried and moved to Denver. Anna had taken a position as a schoolteacher in Caldwell at the request of the town council, which had been advertising the post for 8 months without attracting a permanent candidate. She was 24 years old when she stepped off the train at Caldwell Station in April of 1882, and she had not come looking for anything except work and a measure of independence. She was not soft, but she was not hard either. She was precise, thoughtful, occasionally funny in a dry way that caught people off guard, and she had a habit of watching people carefully before she said a single word to them, a habit that some people in Caldwell found disconcerting, and that Levi Fairchild had found, from the very first moment he noticed it, completely and dangerously arresting. He had met her at the general store, completely ordinary circumstances. He had been there to collect a supply order, and she had been there asking about the schoolhouse key. Frank Holt at the counter had been explaining that the key was typically held by the mayor, Aldous Perrin, whose office was on the second floor of the land claims building 3 streets over, and Anna had been listening to this information and nodding with the patience of someone who had expected small-town bureaucracy and was simply noting its precise shape. Levi had not meant to say anything. He had his supply list in his hand, and his mind on a fence that needed replacing before the week was out. But something about the quality of her attention, the way she listened to Frank without interrupting, without fidgeting, without performing impatience even when Frank repeated himself twice, had made Levi set his list down on the counter. "I can show you where Mayor Perrin's office is," he said. "I was heading that direction." He had not been heading that direction at all. She looked at him the way she looked at everyone, measured and calm, and then she said, "That is kind of you, thank you." They walked the 3 streets together, and by the time they reached the land claims building, Levi had learned that she was from St. Louis, that she had been teaching for 2 years in a private household before taking this post, that she thought Kansas smelled better than she had expected, and that she had a dog back in St. Louis, a terrier named Bishop, that she had left with a neighbor. He had told her almost nothing in return because he was not a man who told things easily. She had not seemed to mind. She had thanked him again at the door and gone inside, and Levi had stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment longer than was necessary before he turned and walked back to the general store to retrieve his supply list. He thought about her the whole ride home. By June, Anna Shelton had become a feature of Caldwell's social landscape in the way that effective teachers do, gradually, through small actions that accumulate into large trust. She ran her classroom with a firm but generous hand. She organized a spelling contest that drew more children than the town had expected. She helped Mrs. Reuben Ochoa, whose husband had gone lame after a horse-breaking accident, by teaching the woman's eldest daughter extra lessons free of charge so the girl might qualify for a teaching post herself one day. Levi saw Anna at the Saturday market, at the occasional church service he attended out of residual obligation, and twice at the summer socials that the town organized in the square. He watched her the way he had always watched things that interested and unnerved him in equal measure, from a careful distance, making no sudden moves. He would have gone on watching indefinitely if Clem Wheeler had not said something. It was a July evening, and they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house after a long day of moving cattle to the north pasture. The sun was going down in that slow Kansas way that turned the whole sky amber and violet, and Clem had a cigarette between his fingers and a knowing look on his weathered face. "You are going to wait yourself right out of the chance," Clem said, not looking at Levi, just looking at the sunset. Levi said nothing. "That schoolteacher," Clem clarified. "Miss Shelton." "I do not know what you are talking about," Levi said, Clem smoked his cigarette. All right. The silence sat between them for a while, the cattle lowed in the distance. A meadowlark called twice and fell silent. She is not going to stay here forever, Clem said eventually. Women like that, educated women with choices, they move on if nobody gives them a reason to stay. Levi turned his hat over in his hands, the same gesture he would make months later in the train station, a habit he did not know he had. She does not even know my name properly, Levi said. She knows your name, Clem said. Frank Holt told me she asked about you. Who the tall rancher was. Something shifted in Levi's chest, something he did not have a word for and was not certain he wanted one. 2 weeks later, he went to the Saturday market and he talked to Anna Shelton for 40 minutes about books. It turned out that they had both read the same edition of Great Expectations, which Levi had found in his father's trunk after the man died and which had become, somewhat against his will, one of his favorite things he had ever read. Anna had read it twice. She had opinions about Pip that were sharp and specific and entirely different from Levi's opinions about Pip, and they disagreed cheerfully and with increasing animation while the market moved around them and neither of them noticed. After that, it became a regular thing. Not a formal courtship exactly. Levi was too careful for that, too conscious of what it would mean if he committed to something and then lost it. But they talked. At the market, at the post office, twice at the church social. He brought her a book he thought she might like, a natural history volume his father had owned, and she read it in a week and told him 3 things in it were factually incorrect, and 3 others were genuinely astonishing. He fixed a broken hinge on the schoolhouse door without being asked, and without making a point of it, and she thanked him with a directness that made him feel more seen than most conversations he had ever had. By September, Caldwell had formed opinions. The town always formed opinions. It was a modest-sized cattle town, sitting at the end of the Kishom Trail where it crossed into Kansas from Indian Territory, and it had all the virtues and all the limitations of a place that was built on movement but required roots to sustain itself. People talked, and what they talked about that fall was whether Levi Fairchild was going to do something about that school teacher or whether the man was going to let his legendary stubbornness carry him past a chance that, by all observable evidence, he would regret for the rest of his life. The opinion divided along predictable lines. Clem Wheeler and Hector Salinas believed he would eventually act. Mayor Perrin's wife, Clara Perrin, had told anyone who would listen that Levi Fairchild was too married to that ranch to make room for a real woman. The general consensus at the barbershop was that the situation needed a catalyst. The catalyst arrived in October in the form of a man named Douglas Crane. Douglas Crane was a land speculator from Topeka, 32 years old, with a clean suit and a smooth manner, and enough money to make himself comfortable in any room he entered. He came to Caldwell on legitimate business, negotiating the purchase of 200 acres south of town from a rancher who was retiring and moving east. But he had a secondary interest that became apparent within 3 days of his arrival. He had decided that Anna Shelton was precisely the sort of woman he had been looking for. Crane was charming. That was undeniable. He was well-read and well-spoken, and he brought Anna a small box of chocolates from the confectionery and asked her, with considerable polish, whether she might allow him to escort her to the town's harvest social. She said yes. Not because she was particularly drawn to Douglas Crane, but because she was a human being who enjoyed good conversation and social events, and there was nothing wrong with accepting an invitation from a polite man. She had not promised Levi Fairchild anything. He had never asked her for anything. Whatever existed between them lived entirely in the unspoken country neither of them had been brave enough to map. Levi heard about it from Frank Holt at the general store, delivered in the casual tone of someone who expected the information to land harder than it appeared to. Frank was not malicious about it. He simply said, as he weighed out a pound of coffee beans, "I suppose you heard that Crane fella is taking Miss Shelton to the harvest social." Levi said, I did not hear that. He paid for his coffee and his other supplies, and he drove his wagon home, and then he stood in his kitchen for a long time looking at nothing in particular while the coffee sat unground on the table. He did not go to the harvest social. That was the first of his mistakes, though he would not have named it as such at the time. He called it good sense. He called it knowing his place. He called it not making a fool of himself over a woman who was perfectly free to enjoy the company of whoever she chose. He repeated these explanations to himself with such thoroughness that by the night of the social he had almost convinced himself he felt nothing. Almost. What he actually felt, as the lantern light spilled out of the town hall windows and the fiddle music drifted down the quiet street toward the boarding house where he had gone to settle a supply debt, was something very close to what his father would have called a dark past catching up with you. Not a literal dark past, but the past pattern of Levi Fairchild's life, the pattern of holding back, of keeping the door locked, because if you never opened it then nothing could ever get out and hurt you. His mother had died when he was 18. He had loved her with the whole and uncomplicated love that boys have for their mothers, and her death had left a hole in the Fairchild household that Daniel Fairchild addressed by working harder and Levi addressed by becoming very, very careful about what he allowed himself to need. He had been careful for 11 years. At the harvest social, Anna Shelton danced twice with Douglas Crane, once with old Doc Hensley, and once with the mayor's son, who was 15 and asked her with extraordinary earnestness. She had a pleasant evening. Douglas Crane was good company. But when she left the social and walked back to her rented room at Mabel Greer's boarding house, she found herself thinking, with a specific and somewhat inconvenient clarity, that she wished a different man had been there. She wished Levi Fairchild had come. She thought about that on her walk home, and then she put it away, the way she put things away that did not have a clear resolution. She had learned, from the death of her father and the necessity of supporting herself, and the particular experience of being a woman in 1882 who had ambitions beyond marriage as a solution to economic insecurity, that not everything that felt significant would also prove to be workable. She liked Levi. She respected him. She found him interesting in a way that had grown steadily more complicated over the months they had been talking. But he had never once indicated that their conversations meant to him what they meant to her, and she was not a woman who built houses on foundations she could not verify. So she walked home and she slept well and she went to her classroom the next morning, and Douglas Crane lingered in Caldwell for 2 more weeks before completing his land business and departing for Topeka, and the harvest social became simply a thing that had happened. November arrived, and with it the first cold snap, and the dynamics in Caldwell shifted in the small ways that cold weather always produces. People stayed indoors more. Levi came to town less frequently, the ranch demanding his full attention as he prepared the herds and the buildings for winter. He and Anna still saw each other, but less often, and when they did, there was something slightly different in the air between them, some new tension that neither of them named or addressed. It was Anna who changed things, finally, not deliberately, exactly, but with the directness that was simply her nature. They were at the post office on a gray November afternoon. She was collecting a parcel and he was mailing a payment to a supplier in Wichita. They stood at the counter together in a companionable silence that then became a slightly less companionable silence, and then Anna turned and looked at him with those careful eyes. "Levi," she said, "can I ask you something plainly?" "Go ahead," he said, though something in him tightened. "I cannot tell if you are interested in me or if you are simply a man who is naturally kind to everyone, and I have been reading more into our conversations than exists in them." The directness of it hit him like cold water, not unpleasant, but bracing. "I am interested in you," he said. The words cost him something to say, but once they were out, they sat solidly in the air between them without any of the disaster he had feared. "Then why did you not come to the harvest social?" she asked, not accusing, just wanting to understand. He looked at her. He had not expected this conversation to happen at the post office. He had not expected to be ready for it. He was not, in fact, ready for it. He was a man who had spent 11 years building a particular kind of internal architecture, and she was asking him to open a door in it without any warning. "I was afraid," he said, which was the truest thing he had said out loud in years. Something softened in her face, not pity. Something warmer and more complex than that. "I see," she said quietly. They left the post office together and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the gray November air, and Levi asked her if she would allow him to call on her properly, to take her to dinner at the hotel dining room, to be, in the clear and unambiguous terms that small-town life required, a man who was courting her. She said yes, this time meaning it entirely. The weeks that followed were some of the best of Levi Fairchild's life, and he would hold that knowledge like a stone in his fist in the darker months to come. They had dinner twice at the hotel. He drove her out to the ranch one Sunday afternoon and showed her the land, all 4,000 acres of it, the south pasture and the north pasture, and the place by the creek where the cottonwoods grew tall and dropped their cotton in summer like a slow inland snow. She stood at the fence line and looked out over the grassland with the wind in her face, and she said, "I can see why you love this," and the simplicity of her understanding felt like something he had not known he was waiting to receive. She read to him from her books when they sat on Mabel Greer's front porch in the afternoons. He was not a man who thought he needed to be read to, and it turned out he was wrong about that. She had a reading voice that was precise and warm, and occasionally dropped into a register of humor that made him laugh out loud, which surprised them both. He kissed her for the first time in December, standing at the gate of Mabel Greer's boarding house while the temperature was in the low 20s, and their breath was visible between them. It was careful and deliberate and not long, but it was real, and when he stepped back she was looking at him with an expression he did not have a word for, and that he hoped he would have years to learn the vocabulary of. He thought about asking her to marry him. He thought about it often in the way of a man who circles a fire to feel its warmth without committing to sitting beside it. He wanted to ask her, but something held him back, some deeply embedded habit of self-protection, some voice that sounded like his father's and said, "Not yet, make sure of the ground before you build. Do not risk what you cannot afford to lose." And then January came, and with it, the event that changed everything. It began with a letter. The letter arrived for Levi at the Caldwell post office on the 8th of January, 1883. It was from a lawyer in Wichita, representing the estate of a man named Gerald Thorpe, who had been Daniel Fairchild's business partner before Levi was born, and who had apparently died in November. The letter informed Levi that Thorpe had left him a parcel of land adjacent to the Broken Bow's southern boundary, approximately 300 acres, which, if folded into the existing ranch, would significantly expand his grazing capacity and his water access. This should have been uncomplicated good news. It was not. What the letter did not say, but what Levi discovered when he rode to Wichita to meet with the lawyer, was that the 300 acres came with a condition. Thorpe had tied the bequest to a requirement that Levi pay off the remaining debt on the parcel within 90 days, a debt amounting to nearly $800, or the land would revert to Thorpe's nephew in Nebraska. $800 was, in 1883, a substantial sum. It was not impossible, but it would require Levi to make decisions he had been putting off, specifically the decision about whether to sell a portion of his herd at winter prices, which were poor, or to take on additional debt to cover the balance. Levi came home from Wichita with his jaw set and his mind occupied, and in the way of men who are accustomed to carrying things alone, he carried this alone. He did not tell Anna about the letter or the condition or the financial pressure. He did not want to bring her into a problem he had not yet solved. He did not want her to see the ranch as a precarious thing when he had been presenting it as a stable one. And somewhere underneath those reasonable explanations was the older and less reasonable fear, the the one that whispered that if she saw the full weight of what he was managing, she might decide that the life he was offering was not worth what it would cost her. He became quieter, preoccupied. He missed 2 of their planned meetings without adequate explanation, sending word through Hector that he was occupied with ranch business. When they did see each other, he was present but distant in a way that she noticed, and that he could not adequately explain without revealing what he was hiding. Anna noticed. Of course she noticed. She was a woman who had built her understanding of the world on careful observation, and she watched the change in Levi with the kind of calm that comes not from indifference but from years of learning to assess before reacting. She waited. She gave him room. She told herself that ranching in winter was hard, and that men dealt with pressure differently than women, and that she was not going to manufacture a crisis from behavior that might have a simple and unalarming explanation. She waited for 3 weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, on a Friday afternoon in early February, she went to the ranch. She had been there before, the Sunday afternoon when he showed her the land. She knew where the house was, and she rode there on the horse she sometimes borrowed from the livery stable, a steady gray gelding named Pilgrim. She found Levi in the barn, alone, working on a broken harness with the focused aggression of a man who is using physical work to manage something that physical work cannot actually fix. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked, very briefly, as if he was both relieved and alarmed in equal measure. "Anna," he said. "Tell me what is happening," she said, not unkindly, just clearly. He set down the harness. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him calculating, the way she had seen him calculate before, measuring what to say against what to keep back, the habit of a man who had learned early that the things you revealed were the things that could be used against you. "It is ranch business," he said. "Nothing that concerns you." She had expected some version of this answer. It still stung. "If you want me to be part of your life," she said quietly, "then the things in your life concern me. That is what it means." He said nothing. The barn was cold, and the light coming through the gaps in the boards was the thin gray light of February in Kansas, and somewhere outside Clem Wheeler was moving hay and making no pretense of not listening. "Levi," she said, "I am not asking you to have no problems. I am asking you to let me know when you have them." He opened his mouth and then closed it. She could see the war in him, the old locked door versus the newer and more frightening willingness to open it. He told her then. About the letter, the debt, the 90-day condition, the winter cattle prices that made selling at a loss the only immediate option. He told her with the flat, specific language of a man who was very uncomfortable with vulnerability, giving her facts instead of feelings, but the facts were enough. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is manageable, Levi. That is not a catastrophe. It is $800. It is a problem with solutions," she said. "I can help you think through them." Something shifted in his expression. Not the warmth she had hoped for, but something complicated, something that looked, against all reason, like resistance. "I do not need you to solve my problems," he said, and his voice, though not unkind, had a wall in it. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know you do not need me to," she said carefully. "I am offering to think through them with you. That is different." "Anna," he picked up the harness again. The wall was fully up now. "I appreciate you coming out here. I am going to handle this. Let me handle it." She rode back to Caldwell on Pilgrim in the thin February cold, and she was not angry exactly. She was something more complicated than angry. She was beginning to understand, with a clarity that was painful precisely because of how much it cost her, that the thing she had taken for strength in Levi Fairchild, his self-sufficiency, his steadiness, his ability to carry weight without complaint, was the same thing that was going to keep him at a distance from her no matter how much they both felt. And she was not sure, riding that cold road back to town, that she had enough ground to stand on to keep waiting for him to change. She did not stop seeing him. But something had shifted between them. Some fault line had appeared, and they both felt it, and neither of them spoke about it directly, and this was its own kind of betrayal, she thought. the small daily betrayal of two people who cared about each other choosing safety over the terrifying honesty that might have bridged the gap. In March, something happened that broke what remained of the fragile structure they had built. There was a woman named Patience Holt, Frank's cousin, who had come to stay with the Holt family for the spring. Patience was 27, pretty in a conventional way, and interested in Levi Fairchild in a manner she did not trouble to conceal. She made it her business to stop by the general store whenever Levi came to town, to find reasons to speak to him, to laugh at things he said with a warmth that verged on theater. Levi was not interested in Patience Holt. This was a fact. It was a clear, simple, uncomplicated fact that was unfortunately not visible from a distance. Anna saw Patience talking to Levi outside the general store on a Tuesday afternoon in March. She saw Patience put her hand on Levi's arm while she laughed at something. She saw Levi's polite smile in response, the restrained expression of a man who was being courteous to someone he was not particularly engaged with, but she was not close enough to read the restrained quality of the smile, only its existence. And because the fault line between them was already there, because she had already begun to doubt the ground she was standing on, she did not go over. She turned and walked the other way. She spent that evening in her room at Mabel Greer's boarding house, which was small and clean, and had a window that looked out on the street, writing a letter to her former supervisor in St. Louis, a woman named Mrs. Harriet Blake, who ran a private academy and who had, on 2 previous occasions, offered Anna a teaching position. She did not send the letter immediately. She folded it and put it in her desk drawer and told herself she was simply keeping her options open, which was a sensible and practical thing for a woman in her position to do. She was not leaving. She was simply not closing a door. A week later, she saw Patience Holt again, this time at the church social, sitting beside Levi on a bench while he spoke with old Doc Hensley. Patience was beside him the way a woman sits beside a man she has decided she is associated with. Levi did not look uncomfortable. He looked as he often looked in social situations, like a man who was present but somewhere else in his thoughts. Anna left the social early. When Levi came to call on her the following Thursday, she was polite and she was present and she was not fully there, and he knew it. He could read her silences by now with some accuracy, and this one was not comfortable or thoughtful. It was protective. "What is wrong?" he asked. She considered telling him. She considered asking him directly about Patience Holt, which was the honest and direct thing to do. But the February afternoon in the barn was still with her, the memory of his wall going up, and some part of her that had been bruised by it was not willing to offer another vulnerability without something to stand on. "Nothing," she said. "I am a little tired." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The fault line widened, invisible and irreversible, while they both stood on opposite sides of it, saying nothing that needed to be said. 2 weeks after that conversation, Anna received a reply from Mrs. Harriet Blake in St. Louis. The academy had an opening. The position was better than what Anna currently held. St. Louis was a city. A real city, with libraries and concerts and lecture series, and the specific energy of a place that was building something larger than itself. The salary Mrs. Blake was offering was nearly twice what Caldwell paid. Anna wrote back and said she would take it. She told herself it was the right decision. She told herself she was a woman who made practical choices, and this was a practical choice. She told herself that Levi Fairchild had been given every opportunity to be clear about what he wanted, had chosen instead to keep her at arm's length behind the wall of his pride and his fear, and that she was not obligated to spend the rest of her life waiting for a man to decide she was worth the risk of needing. She told herself all of this with considerable conviction. She believed approximately half of it. She gave notice to the Caldwell School Board in early April, and because she felt the information should come from her rather than through the town's efficient gossip network, she told Levi herself. She went to the ranch on a Saturday morning, while the Kansas spring was beginning to turn everything green and the air smelled of new grass and wet earth, and she told him she was leaving for St. Louis at the end of May. She had expected him to argue. She had steeled herself for an argument, had prepared her reasonable points, the better position, the city, the opportunity, the entirely justified frustration of a woman who had been given half a courtship and no certainty. He did not argue. He went very still, the way animals go still when something has surprised them before they decide whether to flee or stand, and then he said, "I see," 2 words, flat and contained. "Well, I hope the position suits you." She had driven Pilgrim all the way out here for "I hope the position suits you." She nodded. She said it was kind of him to say so. She turned Pilgrim around and rode back to Caldwell. And that, the conversation in the yard of the Broken Bow Ranch on a green April morning in 1883, was where everything that should have been a beginning instead became the thing that had to be undone. May arrived. Anna began the process of packing her life into 2 carpet bags and a steamer trunk, which she arranged to have shipped separately. She said her farewells to the people she had come to care about, Mrs. Ochoa and her daughter Catalina, who were both doing well, Doc Hensley, who gave her a bottle of tincture for traveling nausea with the gravity of a man presenting a major gift, Mabel Greer, who cried briefly and then made Anna 2 pies to take on the train. She had not spoken to Levi since April. She had seen him twice, in passing in town, and they had exchanged the carefully neutral greetings of 2 people who were protecting something by not touching it. She bought her train ticket on a Tuesday. St. Louis, departing Caldwell on the 22nd of May, 1883, connecting through Wichita. The 22nd was a Tuesday. Levi knew she was leaving on a Tuesday because Clem Wheeler had heard it from Frank Holt, who had heard it from Mabel Greer, and the information had sat in Levi's chest like a stone since Saturday evening. He had not slept properly since April. This was not a metaphor. It was a physical fact. He lay awake in the farmhouse that his father had built on Kansas ground, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the cattle moving and the wind, and the particular deep silence of the plains, and he thought about Anna Shelton with an aching specificity that he could not stop and could not redirect. He thought about the way she listened. He thought about the winter afternoon she had ridden out here and stood in his barn and offered to help him think through a problem, and he had put his wall up and sent her away. He thought about the harvest social he had not attended because he was afraid. He thought about every choice he had made from behind the fortification of his pride, and he saw, with the relentless clarity that sleepless nights produce, that they had all been wrong. Not wrong in the sense of evil or malicious. Wrong in the sense of being driven by fear dressed as sense. He had told himself he was being careful. He had been hiding. He spent Sunday working, which did not help. He spent Sunday night not sleeping, which also did not help. Monday morning he told Clem and Hector what needed doing for the day, and then he went inside the farmhouse and sat at his father's kitchen table and stayed there for 2 hours, completely motionless, in the way of a man having a genuine reckoning. His father had been a man of enormous pride. Not vanity, exactly, but the specific pride of a man who believed that asking for help was the same as admitting weakness, and that admitting weakness was the same as inviting catastrophe. Daniel Fairchild had built the Broken Bow through sheer and relentless self-sufficiency, and he had passed this to his son as both inheritance and warning, though he had never intended the warning part. Levi sat at his father's table, and he thought about what that pride had cost him. His father had carried the burden of the ranch's financial difficulties alone for 2 years before they broke him. He had never told his wife, Levi's mother, about the debt until it was too late to address it with anything except crisis measures. He had never told Levi until the month before he died, and by then there was nothing to do but hand it over and hope the son was stronger. The pride had not been strength. The pride had been a wall that kept help out while the man inside it slowly ran out of room. Levi sat at his father's table and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical in its force, that he had been building the same wall, that he had been doing it with Anna for a year, and that the train leaving Caldwell on Tuesday morning was the direct consequence of it. Not her fault. His. He could let her go. He could keep his pride and his silence and his wall, and he could watch Anna Shelton board that train and live the rest of his life on the Broken Bow, which was a good life, a real life, a life that would sustain him. He could do that. He did not want to do that. He wanted Anna Shelton. He wanted her in his life with a force that was no longer something he could call manageable or contained. He wanted to talk to her every day and hear her opinions about books and watch her stand at the fence line looking at the grassland with the wind in her face. He wanted to be the man she came to when she had a problem, and he wanted to be allowed to come to her with his, without shame and without the fear that needing her would somehow cost him something he could not afford. He wanted to be a different man than his father had taught him to be, not a lesser man, but a braver one. Brave in the specific direction that cost him the most. He went to bed Monday night and slept for 3 hours. At 4 in the morning he got up, dressed, saddled his fastest horse, a 5-year-old bay named Ranger, and rode toward Caldwell in the dark. He had 22 miles to cover and approximately 3 hours before the train from Wichita passed through. He rode like he was running from something, or toward something, which amounted to the same thing. He reached the edge of Caldwell as the sun was coming up, painting the eastern sky in streaks of gold and pale orange. He pushed Ranger down the main street at a pace that made 2 early-rising shopkeepers look up in alarm, and he swung down in front of Mabel Greer's boarding house and took the porch steps 2 at a time and knocked on the door. Mabel Greer answered in her dressing gown, her gray hair down, an expression of maximum displeasure on her face that shifted into something between surprise and speculation when she saw who it was. "She has already gone to the station," Mabel said, before he could speak. He was already turning around. He reached the station door at a dead run and burst through it and said her name, and Anna Shelton turned around slowly, with a composure that held for exactly 1 second, and the rest of it you already know. The train whistle rose in the distance, sharper now, closer. 11 minutes. Fewer, probably. Levi stood in the middle of the Caldwell train station with his hat in both hands and the station clerk pretending to organize papers he had already organized and 2 passengers examining a departure board with excessive interest. "I have been a fool," he said, not as a dramatic announcement, as a plain and honest accounting. Not a fool in any interesting or complicated way. Just an ordinary fool who was afraid and called his fear good judgment. Anna was looking at him. She had not picked up her bags or moved toward the platform. She had not told him to stop. "I did not come to the harvest social because I was afraid of what it would mean if I showed up," he said. "Not because I did not want to be there. I wanted to be there more than I wanted to be anywhere. I stayed home and told myself it was sense, and it was not sense. It was cowardice." Her expression was very careful and very still. "In January, when you came to the barn and offered to help me think through the debt situation, I should have said yes. I should have told you what was happening. I should have let you in. Instead, I built a wall and you rode back to town in the cold, and I stood there holding a harness and told myself I was being strong, and I was not being strong. I was repeating a pattern I learned from my father and being too proud to examine it." He took a breath. Outside, the whistle was louder. "I have not asked you anything that I should have asked. I have not said anything that I should have said. And I know you have made your plans, and I know you have every right to keep them, and I am not here to tell you that you are making the wrong choice for your life, because you are the only one who can know that." He stopped. "I am here because I could not let you board that train without knowing that I love you, without telling you that I love you and that I am sorry, and that I should have said it months ago when it first became true." The station was absolutely quiet except for the growing rumble of the approaching train. Anna Shelton looked at Levi Fairchild. This big, quiet man standing before her with his hat in his hands and his heart entirely visible on his face for possibly the first time in his adult life. And she felt something in her chest that she had been holding very tightly for a very long time slowly begin to release. "You love me," she said. Not a question. An echo. A thing she was testing for weight. "Yes," he said simply. "Since when?" He thought about it. "Since November in a way I could name, longer than that in ways I could not." She looked at him for a long moment. The train was pulling into the station now. She could hear it, the slow screech of brakes and the tremendous exhalation of steam, and the station clerk had moved to the door to assist passengers, and the two travelers were gathering their things, and in approximately 4 minutes the conductor would call for boarding. "Levi," she said, "if I stay, things have to be different." "Yes," he said immediately. "I need you to talk to me. Not everything, I am not asking for everything at once. But the wall has to come down far enough for me to stand on the same side of it as you." "Yes," he said again. And then, because he was Levi Fairchild and honesty was a thing he could do when he was not hiding behind pride. "I do not know how to do that perfectly. I have not been doing it for a long time, but I want to learn, and I am asking you to let me try." The steam from the locomotive was visible through the station window now, a great white billow in the May morning air. Anna looked at her 2 carpet bags. She looked at the platform door. She looked at Levi, bareheaded and serious and more genuinely vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "I am going to need to send a telegraph to Mrs. Blake in St. Louis," she said. Something shifted in Levi's face. Something that started at his eyes and worked its way across his whole expression, not a smile exactly, at least not yet, but the predecessor to one. "I know the telegraph office," he said. "I imagine you do," she said. "You have lived here your whole life." "I have," he said. She picked up her carpet bags. They walked out of the station together into the May morning, while the train from Wichita sat at the platform breathing steam. The conductor watched them pass with the professional blankness of a man who had seen stranger things. The 2 passengers who had been pretending not to listen boarded without looking back. Mabel Greer was standing on her boarding house porch in her dressing gown when they came up the street, having apparently decided that a good outcome required supervision. She watched them approach with an expression of complete satisfaction. "I need to use your telegraph office address to send a reply," Anna told her. "Of course you do," Mabel said, and held the door open. "I have coffee on." The telegraph to Mrs. Harriet Blake in St. Louis was sent that morning. Anna thanked her for the offer and declined the position, expressing her genuine regret and the hope that another suitable candidate would be found. She did not explain at length. She said only that her circumstances had changed. They had changed. They were changing still, in the way of things that do not shift all at once but begin, in a single morning, to shift. Levi and Anna sat in Mabel Greer's kitchen and drank her coffee, which was strong and very good, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours, which was longer than either of them had talked in the whole of the winter that had nearly separated them permanently. They talked about the harvest social and the barn in February and Patience Holt, and Levi explained what he had not thought to explain before, that Patience Holt was simply Frank's cousin and a sociable woman, and that he had felt nothing except mild courtesy toward her. Anna heard this and felt the specific relief of understanding that the wound had been self-inflicted, which was both better and worse than the alternative. She told him about the letter to Mrs. Blake, the first one, the one she had written before she sent it, the one that had sat in her desk drawer for a week while she told herself she was keeping options open. She told him she had written it after seeing Patience put her hand on his arm outside the general store. He listened to all of it without building a wall. "I should have asked you about it directly," she said. "I was protecting myself." "We have both been protecting ourselves in ways that were making things worse," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "We have." May's sun came through Mabel Greer's kitchen window and made the room warm and bright. Mabel herself had tactfully relocated to her garden with her own coffee cup and was doing something to her rose bushes that required a great deal of attention. "I want to ask you something," Levi said. He had his hat on the table now and his hands around his coffee cup, and he was looking at her with a directness that cost him. She could see it cost him, and she valued the cost. "Ask," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with the intention of asking you to marry me, not as a surprise and not without discussion. I am telling you the intention now so that you know what you are agreeing to." Anna looked at him. 24 years old, sitting in a boarding house kitchen in Caldwell, Kansas, on a May morning in 1883, with 2 carpet bags that no longer needed to go anywhere, sitting by Mabel Greer's back door. She thought about the year she had spent in this town, the classroom and the market and the long conversations and the December kiss at the gate and the February barn and everything that had nearly gone wrong. "I appreciate the honesty," she said. "I am agreeing." He smiled. It was not a small smile. It was the full one, the one she had seen in glimpses throughout their months of careful courtship and that she had wanted to see more of, unguarded and complete. "Good," he said. That summer was the summer that Levi Fairchild learned how to open a door, and Anna Shelton learned that even doors that have been locked a long time can work properly with some patience and a bit of oil. They saw each other 3 times a week, which was twice more than the town's gossips had anticipated and was considered, in the social mathematics of Caldwell, Kansas, a serious courtship by any measure. He told her about his father, not all at once, not in a single dramatic unburdening, but in the way of things that come out when 2 people are spending real time together, over dinner, on a drive, sitting on the porch in the long summer evenings. He told her about Daniel Fairchild's silence and his pride, and the way he had managed everything alone and what that had cost him. He told her about his mother and the hole that her death had left in the household and in him. She listened. She did not try to fix it. She did not offer interpretations he had not asked for. She simply listened, which was what he needed, and occasionally she said things that helped him see his own history from a slight angle that clarified it. He learned that her father's death had done something similar to her, had made her deeply self-reliant in ways that were genuinely useful and in ways that were a defense mechanism against needing people who might leave. She had left St. Louis before anyone could leave her. She had built her life around her own competence, because her own competence was the one thing she could guarantee. "We are the same," he said one evening, sitting on the bank of the creek where the cottonwoods grew tall. It was July and the evening air was sweet and the creek was running clear over the stones. "We have the same wound," she said, which was a more specific thing. "That is different from being the same." "Is it a good kind of different?" he asked. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The cottonwoods shifted in the evening breeze. "I think so," she said. "I think people with the same wound can sometimes help each other heal it, if they are careful and honest about it." He put his arm around her and they sat by the creek in the July evening and watched the water go over the stones, and Levi felt something in his chest that he had not felt in many years, perhaps had never felt in quite this form. Not happiness exactly, though it was that too. Something more fundamental, the feeling of not being alone in a way that had cost something to admit but was therefore entirely real. In August, he asked her to marry him. Not on the creek bank, though that would have been romantic. He asked her on the porch of the Broken Bow Ranch house on a warm August evening, while Clem and Hector were conspicuously occupied in the far pasture. He had not bought a ring because rings were not a common feature of ranch life in Kansas in 1883, but he had driven to Wichita earlier in the week and had purchased a small garnet brooch at a jewelry shop on the main street, because Anna wore brooches on her good dresses and the garnet was the color of the Kansas winter sunset. He gave her the brooch and said, "Anna Shelton, I love you. I would like to spend my life with you on this ranch and anywhere else life takes us, and I am asking if you will marry me with the full understanding that I am still learning to be the man you deserve, but that I intend to keep learning until I have got it right." She turned the garnet brooch over in her hands. The stone caught the evening light and glowed. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." She kissed him, which was somewhat more emphatic than the December kiss at the boarding house gate, and from somewhere in the general direction of the far pasture, there was a brief, quickly suppressed sound that might have been a cheer from Clem Wheeler, and Levi pretended not to hear it, though the corner of his mouth went very slightly upward. They were married in October of 1883, at the Caldwell Church, on a bright, cool day when the sky was that specific deep blue that Kansas produces in autumn as a kind of apology for the summers. The ceremony was conducted by Pastor Elias Grover and attended by most of the town, including Clem Wheeler and Hector Salinas, who both wore their best clothes and looked simultaneously proud and slightly pained by the formality. Mabel Greer sat in the front pew and cried in a cheerful and unashamed way. Mrs. Ochoa and her daughter Catalina were there, Catalina having just accepted a teaching position in Wichita, which Anna counted as one of the achievements she was most proud of. The reception was held in the town hall, the same hall where the harvest social had been held a year ago September, and Levi danced with Anna twice, which everyone noted because Levi Fairchild was not considered a dancing man. He was not a technically accomplished dancer. He was, however, a genuinely willing one, which Anna would tell him afterward was more valuable. They drove back to the Broken Bow that evening in Levi's wagon, under a sky full of stars, with a wool blanket across their laps and the Kansas wind around them. And Anna looked up at the stars and Levi looked at Anna, and neither of them said anything for a while because neither of them needed to. "We are home," she said eventually. "We are," he said. She had brought her books, which now occupied 2 shelves in the ranch house parlor. She had brought her desk, which Levi placed by the window that looked south over the pasture, and at which she wrote letters to her mother in Denver, and to Mrs. Ochoa, and to Catalina in Wichita, and to her old St. Louis neighbors who were still caring for Bishop the Terrier, who turned out to be 11 years old and had passed away in the summer, which made Anna sad in a quiet and specific way that Levi sat beside her through without trying to make it better than it was. Life on the Broken Bow was not without its difficulties. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was harder than the previous 2, with 3 weeks of severe cold that cost them 11 head of cattle and required Levi and Clem and Hector to work 18-hour days to keep the rest of the herd alive. Anna helped, not with the cattle, which was not her skill, but with the household and the meals and the accounting. The ranch's books, which had been kept in Levi's cramped and somewhat chaotic handwriting in 3 different ledgers, became, within 2 months of her arrival, a single organized ledger in her precise hand that made the finances legible for the first time. When she showed him the reorganized accounts, Levi looked at them for a long moment and then looked at her. "You have been doing this for 2 months," he said. "Since November," she said. "I hope that is acceptable. It is the best thing that has happened to this ranch's finances since the south pasture fence was replaced," he said. She smiled. "Good, because I also found 3 payments that were being double charged by your supplier in Wichita, and I have written him a letter." He stared at her. "How much?" "Approximately $40 across the last 18 months, she said. "Anna, I know. I am going to need to sit down." "You are sitting down." He looked at the ledger again and then at her, and then he laughed, which was the specific unguarded laugh she had first heard at the Saturday market when they were arguing about Pip, and it was, she thought, one of the finest sounds she had ever heard. The Thorpe land parcel, the 300 acres with the 90-day condition, had been resolved the previous spring. Levi had sold 40 head of cattle at winter prices, which stung, and had borrowed $200 from the Caldwell Bank at a rate he was not thrilled about, but he had met the condition, and the land was now legally part of the Broken Bow. With Anna's reorganized accounting, and the recovered $40 from the double-charging supplier and the improved grazing capacity of the new acreage, the ranch's finances were the best they had been in Levi's tenure. In the spring of 1885, Anna discovered she was pregnant. She told Levi on a March morning while they were eating breakfast, because she was not a woman who built up to important information with elaborate preamble. She simply said, "I believe I am expecting a child, and from what I have calculated, the baby should arrive in October." Levi set down his coffee cup. He looked at her across the kitchen table of the Broken Bow Ranch house, his father's kitchen table at which he had sat on a February morning in 1883 in the dark before dawn, and decided to ride to her door, and he felt something swell in his chest that was enormous and wordless and entirely different from any feeling he had previously catalogued. "October," he said. "Yes," she said. She was watching him with the same careful attention she had always watched him with, measuring his response. He got up from the table and came around to her side and took her hands and said, "Anna, thank you." She looked up at him. "It is not only my doing," she said, which made him smile. "I am aware," he said. "I am thanking you for this life, this whole life, the one you could have gotten on the train and gone to St. Louis instead of staying for." She squeezed his hands. "I am glad I stayed," she said. "Even the hard winter." "Even the hard winter," he confirmed. He went out and told Clem Wheeler, who responded by taking off his hat and pressing it against his chest and saying, with more emotion than Levi had ever seen him display, "Well, that is the best news I have heard since they finished the railroad." He then shook Levi's hand with vigor and went to find Hector, who reportedly had to sit down on a fence post for a moment. The pregnancy went well. Anna continued her work with the ranch accounts and began teaching Catalina Ochoa's younger sister, who was determined to learn everything she could before the new county school was built. The summer was mild enough to be merciful, and Levi hovered with a concern that Anna found both touching and gently exhausting. "I am not made of glass," she told him in August, when he suggested for the third time that she should perhaps not ride Pilgrim anymore. "I know you are not," he said. "You are considerably more durable than glass, but if you fell off that horse I would not survive it." "I will not fall off Pilgrim," she said. "I have not fallen off Pilgrim once in 4 years." "There is a first time for everything," he said. She looked at him with the expression she had developed for moments when his concern crossed from touching into overprotective, which was a look that combined amusement with a gentle but firm assertion of authority over her own decisions. He recognized the look by now and took it in good spirit. "If it makes you feel better," she said, "I will agree to not jumping any fences." "You were not planning to jump fences anyway." "No," she admitted. "But now you have my word on it." Their son was born on the 14th of October, 1885, in the ranch house bedroom, with Doc Hensley attending and Mabel Greer present as a matter of absolute necessity despite the long drive from Caldwell, because Mabel had declared months ago that she would be present, and no one had the energy to argue with her. The labor was difficult in the middle hours, and then resolved with what Doc Hensley called good determination from the mother, which Anna took as the medical compliment it was intended to be. The boy was healthy and loud and had Levi's dark hair and Anna's eyes, which were the color of deep water in winter, and Levi held him with the profound carefulness of a man who had spent his whole life moving heavy things and had just been handed something he was afraid of dropping. "He looks like you," Anna said from the bed, tired but clear-eyed and present. "He has your eyes," Levi said, not looking away from the baby. "What are we calling him?" They had discussed names. They had not settled the discussion. Levi had some ideas. Anna had others. They had agreed to wait and see what the child looked like, as if the child might arrive with a name already attached to his expression. "Daniel," Levi said. He looked up from the baby. "If you agree." It was his father's name. She understood all that it meant. "Daniel," she said. "Yes, I agree." Daniel Fairchild arrived in the world on an October morning with his mother's eyes and his grandfather's name and his father's hair. And Clem Wheeler and Hector Salinas heard the news from Doc Hensley before the morning was out, and both of them sat on the porch of the ranch hand quarters for a while not saying anything in particular, which was their version of emotional processing. The years that followed were not without hardship, because Kansas in the 1880s did not offer hardship-free living to anyone, but they were full in the way that lives can be when the foundation they are built on is solid. The Broken Bow grew steadily under Anna's accounting and Levi's management. They hired 2 more hands as the herd expanded. The south pasture fence that had started as a debt became one of the best-maintained stretches of fencing in Sumner County. Daniel grew up running between the house and the barn, fascinated by horses and by the books on his mother's shelves in roughly equal measure. By the time he was 3, he could name every horse on the ranch, and had sat in Anna's lap while she read to him from every natural history book in the collection, including the one with the 3 factual errors, which she pointed out to him with the same precision she had used when pointing them out to his father years ago. Levi watched his son with an expression that he did not have words for, which was acceptable because he had a wife who had words for everything and who knew when to use them, and when to let things simply be what they were. In the summer of 1887, they had a daughter. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that the name suited her, and she arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had, and immediately established herself as someone who had very specific opinions about the world and was going to share them. She was, Anna told Levi one evening with a perfectly straight face, exactly like him. He looked at their daughter, who was currently refusing to eat her supper with an expression of dignified determination, and said, "She is exactly like you." They argued pleasantly about this for 15 minutes and resolved nothing. Clem Wheeler, who was getting older and whose knees had started giving him trouble, taught Daniel to identify horse breeds by the age of 4, which Levi approved of and Anna observed with the expression of a woman who was noting the beginning of something that would consume significant household resources in the years ahead. Hector Salinas, whose family was in New Mexico and whom the Fairchilds had long since come to regard as part of their own, made both children a gift of a carved wooden horse each Christmas with a precision and care that made the objects remarkable. In 1889, Levi and Anna made the trip to St. Louis. It was not something Levi had ever planned to do, having spent his entire life in Kansas and having no particular need for cities. But Anna's mother had moved from Denver to St. Louis following her second husband's death, and Anna had not seen her mother in 6 years, and Daniel was old enough to travel, and Clara, at 2, was old enough to be a handful on a train, which she proved with great commitment. St. Louis was an enormous and astonishing place to a man who had spent his whole life in Caldwell, Kansas. Levi walked its streets with the composed expression of a man who was not going to let anything surprise him while being continuously surprised. The buildings were tall. The crowds were dense. There was noise at every hour that had no relationship to cattle or weather or anything he understood. He did not love it, but he understood, standing on a street corner in St. Louis while Anna and her mother walked ahead of him holding Clara between them, why a younger and less anchored version of the woman he loved had found the idea of this city appealing. It had things to offer, different things than the Broken Bow. Not better things, he thought, but different. Anna's mother, whose name was Eleanor Whitfield now, was a warm and somewhat theatrical woman who exclaimed over both children and told Levi he was very handsome in a way that embarrassed him completely, which Anna found privately hilarious. Eleanor approved of Levi with the generous approval of a woman who is simply glad to see her daughter happy, and she told Anna, in the 2 minutes they had alone in Eleanor's kitchen, that the man clearly thought the sun rose and set on Anna specifically. "He does not say it like that," Anna said, stirring the coffee. "He does not have to say it," Eleanor said. "That is what makes it convincing." They stayed in St. Louis for 10 days. On the last evening, after the children were asleep in Eleanor's spare room, Anna and Levi sat on Eleanor's small porch and looked at the city lights, which were very different from the Kansas stars but had their own kind of beauty. "Are you glad we came?" Anna asked. "Yes," he said, and then because he was Levi Fairchild and honesty was something he did now without the wall getting in the way, "and I am glad we are going home." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Me too," she said. The train back to Caldwell took 2 days. with Clara loudly narrating the passing landscape and Daniel managing to spill an entire cup of water on a very patient fellow passenger's coat, for which Levi apologized with such thorough mortification that the passenger, a retired school principal from Topeka, ended up reassuring him for 20 minutes, and then spent the remainder of the journey teaching Daniel card games, which was probably not the intended outcome. They came back to the Broken Bow on a September evening, and as the wagon came over the last rise before the ranch house and Anna saw the low stone and timber building with its lit windows and the cottonwood windbreak, and the familiar shape of the Kansas grassland stretching out around it in the dying light, she felt the specific and irreplaceable feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The 90s brought change to Caldwell and to Sumner County in the way the decade brought change everywhere. The open range was closing. The long cattle drives from Texas were winding down as railroad lines pushed further south and made the northern route unnecessary. The wildness of the frontier was being domesticated by barbed wire and county ordinances and the steady weight of settlement. Levi adapted, as the good ranchers always did. He shifted away from the longhorn cattle of the trail drive era and began building a herd of better quality stock, working with a cattle broker in Wichita to sell directly to meat packers rather than through the trail drives. The Broken Bow became a more refined operation than Daniel Fairchild had ever imagined it could be, smaller in some ways but more financially stable, and Anna's accounting, by now extended into a proper system with quarterly reconciliations and a clear record of every transaction, was widely regarded among the ranching families of Sumner County as the standard other ranches should be emulating. She was asked in 1891 by 3 different ranch families to help them set up similar accounting systems. She did it, charging a modest fee that she put into an education fund she was building for Daniel and Clara. It was not teaching exactly, but it used the same instinct, the desire to pass on what she knew to people who needed it. Clem Wheeler's knees eventually forced his retirement in 1892. He moved into a small house in Caldwell proper, given to him by Levi with an ease that had taken Levi many years of opening doors to arrive at, the understanding that generosity was not weakness, and that caring for the people in his life was not a vulnerability but a choice. Clem protested briefly because that was his nature, and then accepted because that was also his nature. He died in 1894 at the age of 67 in his own house, in his own bed with his affairs in order. Levi and Anna attended the funeral with Daniel, who was 8 and understood something about it, and Clara, who was 7 and held her father's hand through the whole service with a gravity that made Levi look straight ahead at the pastor and breathe very carefully. Hector Salinas stayed. He was younger than Clem by 7 years and had no intention of retiring, and the Fairchild children had adopted him as a kind of honorary grandfather, which he received with the dignified pleasure of a man who has earned something real. He taught Daniel to rope a calf in the spring of 1893, which took 3 weeks and resulted in 1 broken fence post and 1 extremely startled calf and Daniel's complete dedication to the project until he achieved it. Daniel Fairchild grew up to be a young man who had his father's physical solidity and his mother's intellect, which was, as Anna had always quietly suspected, a more powerful combination than either parent offered separately. He went to a proper school in Wichita at 15, which was a compromise between Levi's instinct to keep him on the ranch and Anna's determination that he should have every educational advantage she could provide. He came home for summers and brought books and new ideas and opinions about things, which Levi listened to with the expression of a man who was genuinely interested while simultaneously reserving the right to disagree. Clara went to school in Wichita 2 years after Daniel, and if Daniel was intellectually ambitious, Clara was something beyond that, a force of organized determination that had been building since she was 2 years old and refusing supper. She wanted to be a doctor. In 1895, in Kansas, this was not impossible, but it required a level of commitment that most people, including some who should have known better, told her was impractical. Anna told her it was entirely practical and helped her draw up the educational path that would get her there. Levi listened to people who suggested his daughter's ambitions were impractical and said, with the specific calm of a man who was not actually calm, but had learned to express disagreement without aggression, "My daughter is going to be a doctor, and anyone who suggests otherwise to her face will find me considerably less pleasant to deal with." The number of people who suggested this to Clara's face dropped sharply. By the time Levi and Anna had been married 15 years, the Broken Bow was one of the most successful mid-sized ranches in Sumner County. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but consistently well-managed, financially sound, and known for the quality of its stock. Levi had a reputation in the county as a man of absolute reliability, someone whose word was a legal document and whose handshake was a contract. Anna had a reputation as a woman of formidable intelligence and organizational skill who had helped a significant number of the county's farming and ranching families understand their own finances for the first time. They were known as the Fairchilds of the Broken Bow, which was exactly what they were, and which had a weight and a meaning to it that both of them felt in different ways but equally. On a September evening in 1898, Levi and Anna sat on the porch of the ranch house, which had been extended in 1891 to accommodate a larger family and a wider life, and watched the sunset do what Kansas sunsets do, which is to say make everything amber and violet and enormous in a way that never becomes ordinary no matter how many times you see it. Daniel was in Wichita, working with a law firm now, applying his father's steadiness and his mother's precision to an altogether different kind of problem-solving. He wrote every week long, thoughtful letters that Anna answered promptly and Levi answered after composing his responses in his head for several days first, which was simply how he worked. Clara was in Kansas City, completing her medical training. She wrote less frequently but with more density of information per sentence, which was also simply how she worked. She was going to be a very good doctor. This was already evident from the letters. She was going to be a doctor who did not tolerate nonsense from anyone, who had her mother's precision and her father's quiet immovability. And Anna counted the days until she could watch Clara practice her vocation in full. Hector Salinas sat in his rocking chair at the corner of the porch, apparently asleep but almost certainly not, because Hector Salinas at 63 was incapable of fully sleeping when there was anything interesting happening nearby, and two people sitting on a porch watching a sunset after 15 years of marriage was, by Hector's estimation, always interesting. "I have been thinking," Levi said. "That is generally safe to assume," Anna said. She was knitting. She had taken up knitting in 1890 and had become, through the application of the same systematic approach she brought to everything, an extremely accomplished knitter. "I have been thinking about the day at the station," he said. She did not need him to specify which day. There had only been one day at the station that mattered. She looked at him over her knitting. His hair had some gray in it now at the temples and the lines around his eyes were deeper, and he was 51 years old and looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent his life in the Kansas sun doing physical work, and he was, she thought, the finest-looking man she had ever seen. "What about it?" she said. "I have thought about it often," he said. "What would have happened if I had been 5 minutes later, if the train had come early, if you had already been on the platform?" "I have thought about that too," she said. "I almost did not ride," he said. "There was a moment around 3 in the morning when I thought I had no right to, that it was too late and I had squandered my chance by being a fool and the decent thing was to let you go." She set the knitting down. The sunset was pulling all its best colors out across the western sky. "What made you ride anyway?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not the old quiet, the wall quiet, just the thoughtful kind. "I decided that I would rather know I had tried and been refused than spend the rest of my life knowing I had the chance and did not take it because I was afraid of what it would cost me," he said. "Then I decided that I was also going to stop calling fear something else. My father called it prudence. I called it good sense. It was fear, and you were worth more than my fear." Anna looked at him in the last of the amber light. "Yes," she said, "I was," and then because she was Anna Shelton Fairchild and she was entirely direct, "and so were you." He looked at her. "You were worth more than your fear too," she said. "You were worth the risk of staying. I told myself I was being practical, leaving. And I was doing exactly what you were doing. I was calling fear something else and acting on it and calling it a good decision." "We were both fools," he said. "Briefly," she said. "And then you rode to the station." He reached over and took her hand, the hand that had set down the knitting, and held it in his. His hands were the same hands they had always been, large and calloused and capable of extraordinary gentleness. "I am glad I rode," he said. "So am I," she said. "Every single day." From the corner of the porch, Hector Salinas made a sound that was possibly a snore but was more probably the sound of a man who was very satisfied with the way things had turned out. The sun went down over the Broken Bow Ranch on a September evening in 1898, and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas grassland, and Levi and Anna Fairchild sat on their porch holding hands, while the night settled around them and the land breathed in the darkness. And somewhere out in the pasture the cattle moved, and the grass bent in the wind and the creek went over its stones just as it always had. They stayed there until the stars were very bright and the temperature had dropped into the pleasant cool of Kansas autumn, and then Anna picked up her knitting and Levi refilled both their coffee cups from the pot Hector had brought out earlier, and they stayed a little while longer, because there was no reason to go in yet and the evening was too good to waste. It was a complete life, a real one, built on 4,000 acres of Kansas grassland and 2 carpetbags that had never needed to go to St. Louis, and the specific and irreversible decision of a man who had buried his pride and saddled his horse and ridden 22 miles in the dark to say the things he should have said months ago. It was, by any measure that mattered, enough. It was, by the measure of the 2 people living it, everything.